All right, so hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about advanced security notifications from ISC. I'm Eddy Winstead. I've been doing DNS and DHCP network admin, sysadmin stuff for about 30 years now. I've been with ISC for about 10 years. Actually, it's been 11 years now. So I've seen a lot of this internal process and how we do these notifications, why we do them, familiar with some of the history. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about today. Why we do these, what are they, what do they look like internally, and how are they delivered? We spent a lot of time actually talking internally about how to do a security presentation without scary slides. So you can give us some feedback at the end. Did we achieve this goal or not? Usually security talks start off with lots of horrible images and why you should be alarmed. We're not saying you shouldn't be alarmed in this case, but we'll see if we can do it without scary slides. So to get to the point of this, I like to say a lot. I do a lot of the trainings for ISC as well, and I like to say, one thing that we talk about a lot is the internet itself or networks work just fine without the DNS, right? The only problem is it does not work for the humans at all, right? So if you're a routing person, you know that if the DNS is down, you're still able to get where you need to go in terms of the routing infrastructure. If this sort of slide just is a nice slide showing, like internally, like at the enterprise level, if you have a DNS outage, these are the things to the humans that are going to automatically appear that the services themselves are down, right? So your email server could still be functioning just fine, but if the DNS is not properly resolving the name to the IP address, then none of your staff are going to be able to read their email. And of course, this is assuming that you're still operating your email in the days of internet consolidation, blah, blah, blah. But same thing for like your calendar, your any phone systems you have, all of that stuff relies very heavily on DNS. And so one of the things that I get to do in my role here at ISC is talk to a lot of folks about pondering the amount of expense they have invested into their routing and networking infrastructures, and then asking them to think about how much do they also, how much of an expense are they putting on their DNS infrastructure, right? Generally speaking, in most cases, this is way out of whack, right? You have really, really high costs on the routing side, and you're running very low costs on the DNS side. This is great, right? This is part of how the internet got to be what it is, and this is part of ISC's role in the internet ecosystem, if you will, right? If you go throughout, the history of the DNS, Bind was the open source name server software available as the internet was taking shape. These days, we have lots of choices for DNS software, and that's great. For us at ISC, it may sound a little weird, but actually that's a wonderful thing, right? Software diversity is really a good thing, particularly when we're talking about critical services like DNS, okay? These days, you can, there are several open source providers as well, and there are several commercial providers for DNS software. So some of what I'm talking about today is how do you reconcile or solve the problem of if I'm using commercial DNS software, or again, if we go back to the routing example, if there is a vulnerability relating to my routing software, or my routing vendor has some sort of problem, I have, as a consumer of those services, I have a existing relationship with that provider, right? So if there's some sort of CVE, if there's some of this, I got to go ahead and start explaining what the acronyms are, right? That's like half the battle in these things. Common vulnerability and exposure, right, is a CVE. So this is a security issue that could affect services, right? So back to this example of what problem are we solving. In the commercial space, I already have a relationship with my vendor. If I'm using open source software, which a lot of you are, or you wouldn't be watching this or attending this webinar, what do I do in a case of a CVE, right? Now, again, my non-threatening pictures here are based solely on the enterprise, right? But if you're there's obviously very different spaces in the internet, right? So for example, if you're an ISP, what a DNS outage looks like for you is assuming, again, in the modern internet of consolidation, that you're actually running your own DNS servers and not pointing to 8.8.8.8, for example. If you're an ISP admin, you know what that looks like for you, right? And again, trying to do this without scary pictures, but I've been on that side of things. Again, a lot of my experience was on the providing recursive services for clients. And so again, in that example, if there's a DNS outage, what that means is all of my customers, to them, the internet is down. Your Knox phones are ringing off the hook, right? Everybody, to them, you always get the same report: the internet is down. All of us here know the internet is not down, but for them, it means they can't get to whatever their favorite content is, or sites, or whatever, right? So when we talk about CVEs in this case, open source software bind, right? The majority of the CVEs in bind these days are what we typically term as like loss of service or denial of service, right? If you've been administering bind for some time, I will venture to say that you've seen an assert or an insist in your logs, right? So what this means is bind has reached a state, a sort of an unknown state, and in order to prevent further damage, it just asserts and exits, right? So when we get an exit in the software, it means exactly what you think it might mean. Suddenly, all those queries that are coming to that particular DNS server are no longer being answered. Now we have ways, right? Hopefully you have multiple servers, right? So you might have gotten a malformed query or something that triggered an assist, but you have other servers that are running, right? Some of these CVEs that we've had over the past, again, I've been here 11 years, some of them are of the sort that it could take out your entire DNS infrastructure, right? So that's why we have this service. The other thing is, back to a little bit of internet history, if you will. The root server system, of which ISC is one of the root server operators, we operate froot. In the old days, again, bind was pretty much it in terms of software that could handle the root zone and provide root zone services. So in the early days, there was a very concentrated use of bind to provide these very critical services. Again, thankfully, now that, in 2022, we have things like Anycast deployments. They're not just 13 servers anymore. There are thousands, and they run various DNS softwares. They have various DNS infrastructures, various network infrastructures. So it's a very resilient system, right? So that's great. But the history of the advanced security notification became, we're running froot, right? We are obviously in contact with the other 12 or other 11 now root server operators. And so we needed a way to, ensure that critical infrastructure remained up. And part of that was the ability to inform the other root server operators of a vulnerability that we had found or that someone had reported to us, or as well, vulnerabilities in the protocol itself, right? So it's one thing I want to stress is that here at ISC, we're not just reporting the vulnerabilities that are found in Bind or ISC DHCP or Kia. We're also pointing out that someone has discovered a flaw in the way the protocol was designed. And here's a way that folks can take advantage of that, right? Just before my time at ISC was what's termed as the, again, not to be too scary, the DNS Summer of Fear, right? This was 2008 or 9. Anyway, it was the Kaminsky attack, right? So Dan Kaminsky figured out a way that you could essentially cache poison essentially the entire internet. So one of the jokes was like, imagine, 15-year-old kids running your DNS. That's kind of what the internet would have looked like. In terms of what that would have looked like for the internet user, suddenly you're trying to go to your bank. When this happened, the internet was just part of the fabric of our everyday lives, right? So it's something that you trust, even though you may not be doing DNSSEC, et cetera, et cetera. If you type in a website into a web browser, you expect to go to that organization's website, right? So this was a very, frankly, scary time in DNS operations, right? Again, that was right before my time at ISC, but I've heard wonderful stories about how all that was handled. Luckily for us, Kaminsky reported this in a really great fashion and involved all the, at that point, there were multiple DNS softwares available. That brings up an important point that I really want to stress, that if you feel like you have found a security issue in Bind or any of our software, or you're not sure, right? I do have a link at the one of the last slides that has, it's the reference page that shows you how we prefer to receive these reports, right? The same goes as well for any other open source software. If you have a commercial software and you think you found something, obviously you report that back to your vendor. Again, part of this is solving that whole communication issue that you already have established with your commercial providers that you might not have with your open source vendors. All right. So what is the service actually? So what we do is when a vulnerability is either reported to us or one that we find, I will say, a lot of this relates to fuzz testing has come a really long way, right? So there are open source options and commercial options that just sit there and send malformed queries and malformed packets to DNS servers, DHCP servers. So a lot of these vulnerabilities are found that way these days. And so once we have one of those reported to us or one that we find ourselves, then if it scores over a certain number, and I'll do all the sort of nitty-gritty details in a bit about the scoring, but if it scores over a 7.0, then we enter in our advanced security notification process. I'll already, for my technical people on the call, particularly my routing folks, I'll go ahead and apologize that we did reuse the ASN acronym. That is one that we tend to get called out on. Yes, we're not talking about autonomous system numbers here. We're talking about ISC's advanced security notification. So what the process looks like is when we get a report, what happens internally is we go through the scoring process. And again, I'll go through that in a bit. But for those of you with low attention spans, right, we'll talk about exactly what the service is, then we'll get into the details. So we do some scoring, we figure out, what this is doing, and we start this process that essentially there's a set of again, I apologize, something came up on my screen and now I've lost my train of thought. Anyway, what happens is, again, we're in the old days, the history was we need to let the root server operators know about this particular issue. In those days, they were obviously running bind, blah, blah, blah. These days, what we've done with the ASN process is expand the parties, right? So now it's in the modern internet, it's not just the root servers that are running critical DNS infrastructure. It's also pretty much everyone, right? If you're running authoritative services, it's critical that they remain online. If you're running recursive services, meaning you're answering queries on behalf of clients, then certainly it's critical that those remain online. So again, this is essentially an extension of that original program. If you're on the contract side of things, or you've usually on these webinars, we get mostly technical people, but sometimes if you're, we get some, folks that actually, do procurement, blah, blah, blah. That you don't want to, that's a lengthy process, right? So you don't want to be caught in that process before, or during an emergency, I should say, right? And in terms of that, this isn't just about the ASNs, right? A lot of the calls that we get at ISC are, hey, I've been using your software for 10 years. It's great. It's working great, but I'm in an emergency. What that looks like internally, while we try to help as much as we can, most times these days, organizations don't allow us to help until we have like an NDA signed, a master services agreement. All that stuff takes really a long time. Lawyers have to review and blah, blah, blah. So my point back to the ASNs is, if this is a service that you think you're interested in, please do initiate it, because it takes time to get everything set up. And again, why we have this is extending this early notification to folks that are running DNS services with bind in critical situations, right? Which again, is pretty much everyone at this point. I will point out that, and I think I've said it a couple of times, the ASN service is also for KIA and ISC DHCP, but in those, and we have had some CVEs related to those softwares, but it's typically less impact, right? Because the nature of DNS is that everything is happening off of your network. Whereas with the DHCP services, typically that's in a locally defined, constrained network. All right, so what happens internally, we figure out, we score this thing. As an ISC customer, after that sort of onboarding process that I talked about, you have essentially a support queue. And what we do is we relay this information to you via the support portal. When you get your notification, you get every version that's affected. I should say every version that is supported that is affected, right? We know we have a lot of people that run really old ISC code. That's fine. What I'm saying is your version might not be listed there. And typically we get a lot of questions like, is this specific version? I know this version is EOL, but is it affected? What we usually say is probably very much so, but even if it's not, all these other, here's 3 CVEs that one is affected by, right? So one of the things that was on my list to definitely remind you of is that in security focused jobs, or critical infrastructure jobs, one of the best things you can do is remain up to date on your software, right? So, some of this is like, security 101, don't run really old code. Know where you're getting your software from, have a relationship with who you're getting the software from, et cetera, et cetera. So we get, you get this notification in your portal. You're alerted to that the notification is there. You log in and check it. It gives you a description of the vulnerability, how, whether it affects, for example, like authoritative services or recursive services, or if it affects both. You get patched versions right there with that notification. We do have private repositories for our software these days. So if you're using that, then you'll get an access to updated images there. The other thing that's really critical is we really work hard to see, is there a workaround, right? So if there is a workaround, say, if you're able to turn off this option, then that's how you can avoid being vulnerable to this particular security issue. All right, I think I'm going to take a look at the chat right quick because we have a lot of activity there. Let's see here. Okay, perfect. Not anything I need to address, but some activity. So thank you. And now, one day I'm going to learn how to operate Zoom. There we go. All right. The questions were basically, are we going to have like documentation? And yeah, there's a reference slide at the very end of this that will give you probably way more documentation than you will want. All right. So let's get into a little bit about how we do the scoring. So I want to point out that, we do this via what's called the CVSS scoring system. The current version is version 3.1. And so this lays out a way in which you can score software vulnerabilities. This is not ISC specific. We are making use of a process that's been, tried and true. It's what's coming through to my brain, but I'm not sure that's, the right one. Anyway, this process is used by lots of software vendors out on the internet. So we're just using tools that are out there and available for everyone in the software space. Essentially, you have these base score metrics, and I'll walk through some of them. Interestingly, for us, the one that's going to be of most critical importance is attack complexity, right? Particularly when we talk about bind, again, how that differentiates from like DHCP services is we're providing services over the internet that must be reached by definition in order to provide the service, right? People outside of our network must be able to reach these services if we're on the authoritative side. And if we're on the recursive side, clients must be able to query my name servers. They just must. That's how the DNS works. And my recursive servers have to be able to go out and query outside of my network in order to get answers on behalf of my clients, right? So a lot of this, attack vector part for the bind side of things kind of remains pretty stable. And I know I have builds on this slide. Okay. So scope is sort of, am I changing anything? Is anything able to be changed, right? The classic example of this in terms of DNS is cache poisoning, right? If data is able to be changed, like on a recursive server, then that's going to score a lot higher than something that doesn't take place. This is what I was just talking about. Again, I always, I usually get ahead of my slides and builds, and here we are. Attack vector, is this for, again, back to bind, this usually is network related because that's just the nature of the service. Whereas for Kia and ISC DHCP, there's a little more like local adjacent network concerns, not so much on the full network side. The impact metrics, this is most of the time, this is none for us. Where this would score high is, for example, if some other party was able to get like access to your encryption keys. Most of you are using like TSIG or transaction signatures for things like zone transfers. So rarely, but possibly, you know, it could be something like that. These days, you know, the modern internet is very different in terms of DNS. In the old days, you know, again, I said I've been doing this a long time, right? In the old days, if you ran DNS server, usually you'd have these sort of handshake agreements where you would be, you know, secondary for someone else's zone, and they would secondary your zone, right? So it became an issue of like, how much do I trust that party, right? These days in the modern internet, of course, again, back to some of the problem that we're trying to solve, if I'm relying on someone for my critical infrastructure, whether that's providing the service. So for example, a lot of people these days on the authoritative side, you know, run their own authoritative server, but they might, you know, have a secondary service for someone that's like, you know, one of the big authoritative DNS services, right? So again, you have a contractual relationship with that entity, so you can trust them, or at least there are some like legalese that has penalties if something goes wrong, right? And so same thing, that again, to underscore what we're trying to solve here is that, you know, you want to have that relationship in place prior to any issues. So again, if you're using services or if you're using software and critical infrastructure. All right, integrity impact. Most of the time, this is, again, none for our cases. Where it would be high is, of course, in you know, the case of like the Kaminsky situation, any type of cache poisoning, any type of being able to change data would impact the integrity. Privileges, most of the time, is going to be none. Again, most of the time, you know, we're saying that, you know, this isn't like someone has made use of a security vulnerability and has gained access to my like actual server, right? That's a whole different world, right? This is more someone has, you know, the most common, again, is someone has issued a query and it's caused my name server to crash, or it's caused my named my DNS service to crash, right? So in most cases for us, the privilege level is none. Availability impact, you know, obviously for us in this software is typically high, because again, usually for these to score enough where we enter this process, you know, there's a loss of service involved. Now, again, I've been doing sysadmin forever, right? So you can have nanny scripts that restart services and blah, blah, blah. But if there's a malicious party that's actually trying to take your service down, usually it means they know what query they've sent to cause the problem. Now, luckily here, during my time at ISC, most of the reports that we get are, yeah, again, outside of the like fuzz testing and that kind of stuff, most of the reports we get are like, hey, my name server crashed. This was like, this is what I saw in the log. Or it turns out, hey, I sent this query and bind crashed, right? Is this like a known issue? And so again, please, please, please report those directly to us, again, or whoever you're running DNS software from. One of my early days at ISC, we had someone that reported on a public list, hey, if I send this query, bind crashes. Does yours do that? Those are like the absolutely worst case scenarios for us, because then, you know, you essentially have a weaponized situation. Anyone on the internet can send that query and knock off a bunch of bind servers. So please don't do that. I will say, of course, this brings up a good point. In the advanced security notifications, in the event of a 0 day, or in that specific case, someone has publicly disclosed a way to trigger a vulnerability, then the advanced security notification part, the advance really narrows down, right? I mean, essentially, it's all hands on deck situation at ISC. We, of course, notify our customers like as soon as possible, but obviously you don't get that period of time to be able to update before we publicly announce, right? Essentially, your notification goes out, we will let you know this is 0 day, or this is like already out there, please update immediately. And then we, you know, as part of our mission is public service, right? So we have to go ahead and issue new software for everyone. All right. User interaction is usually like none for us. You know, there's usually, because with the nature of this, right, I'm setting up services, and in most cases, the admin doesn't have to do something in order to trigger this. It's already sort of sitting out there. Now, the attack complexity, this is what really, really changes the scoring for us. If the attack complexity is low, and again, that example that I've used several times now, like I can send a query to named to a server I know is running behind, and I can cause that server to exit, or that service to exit, then, you know, that's what we're going to consider low, right? High would be like, you know, someone has to, there's like special conditions, right? Like maybe I have to send a sequence of queries, or something special has to be set up, right, on an authoritative server in order to get this response back on a recursive server, right? So those are the things that we spend a lot of time in these situations debating about what is the actual way to trigger these things, and how does that change the scoring. All right, so if you report something to us, or we find something, you know, we do anything that we have any concern over whether this is a security issue or not, we do our scoring, as I've just pointed out, and where that scoring lands sort of guides what we do, right? So 7 and over is ASN land. You will find our disclosure process listed in the references, as several of you have asked about. Now, if it's below that threshold, that doesn't mean that we don't fix it, right? It just means that it might not be done in a phased disclosure process, right? You'll see a lot of change if you're really geeky and you look at the changes file in bind. You'll see security fixes that did not trigger a CVE, right? These come along, and you know, those are like, you know, as we talked about the scoring, right? It's like a high attack complexity. There's very little risk to you, but it is something that we need to fix, right? There's also cases where we do what's called operational notifications, and those are ones where we feel like it didn't score high enough for us to do the ASN process, but we feel like it's very important to get the data out there. And again, the customers get these notifications first, direct customers of ISC, before we put these out into the public. All right. So this is just showing you what a CVE looks like. This is CVE 2021-25219. So you'll see things here in the description, like what versions are vulnerable, and then actually a description of what the vulnerability is. The other thing I want to point out is that ISC is an official CVE numbering authority. So once we get these reports, we assign the CVE number based on what we've already received and sort of a range of numbers that are available. But you can check to see, you know, if we're the assigning CNA or not. I should say, you know, sometimes you might see something related to our software that's issued by some other party. That can be due to lots of people use our code, right? All right, so here's your references page. Please do check these out. If you want a lot more data on our disclosure policy, as well as my the scoring guidelines that I went through, there's also a link here to, again, please report any potential things responsibly. Even if you think, oh, this is just, oh, I'm just kind of curious about this. This seems odd. Any of that kind of stuff, just, let us know directly. So that we can prevent any of the, fire drills some of the fire drills that we've had to do in the past. Works out better for everyone. And then if you're curious about if your particular version is vulnerable to previously announced CVE, we maintain this security vulnerability matrix here. I do want to point out one thing about sometimes the versions that we have, ISC, sometimes like OS vendors don't update them as quickly as we do. So while you may think that, oh, I'm running, the most common example is like Red Hat, right? Oh, I'm running bind 9.8 on Red Hat something. It turns out like Red Hat is really proactive about patching vulnerabilities, and they do get some advanced notice from us. So as all the OS vendors do. So you may, just because it's listed on our chart as being vulnerable, if you have a question, again, back to this relationship with your vendor, please do ask Red Hat. If most of the times they have backported fixes, they just don't change the bind numbers like we do. All right. Okay. So I've talked quite a bit longer than I expected. Sorry about that. But we can do some Q&A now.
So you have one question
Right.
from Rhonda asking, if we're not ISC bind customers, can we be an ASN customer?
Unfortunately, no. So again, back to this. Well, if you're currently not a bind our ISC customer, and you want to get ASNs, then yes, but the process involves you becoming a direct customer of ISC. Again, a lot of this is so that we have all the non-disclosure agreements in place. One of that's not only protecting us, but it's protecting you, because as a provider, if you become a customer, then we know certain things about your infrastructure, right? It's just natural. We may or may not see your configs, blah, 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 depending on whatever the nature of your issues are. But the NDA is there to protect, you as well, not just us. But there is language that, you can't share these notifications outside of your organization, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I'll actually go ahead and put up the next slide. So if you're interested in this at all, please do contact us, info@isc.org. Most likely when someone calls you back, I'll be on the call as well. So you get to talk to me again. Yay. Yeah. Any other questions, Vicki?
No, that's it. Thank you. I think that was really the only question.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Eddy. This was great.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks everyone. And I'll see you again soon on a webinar or talk to you soon. All right. Take care.